Good day. It's June 14th, 2026. A sitting American president stood in the East Room of the White House on Friday and told the chief executives of the world's most powerful oil companies to write a $100 billion check for Venezuela. They said no. What follows is drawn from on-record statements made by executives in attendance at that White House meeting. Open-source reporting from NBC News and the New York Times and the Trump administration's own publicly announced agreement with Caracas. Before we run any numbers, let's be clear about what Venezuela actually is in 2026. It is a country where the electrical grid fails weekly, where the health system has collapsed to the point that hospitals perform surgery by flashlight, where roughly 8 million people have fled, one of the largest displacement crises in the Western Hemisphere, because the economy has lost more than 80% of its output since 2013. The people still, they're not abstractions. They're workers in fields that once made Venezuela the fourth largest oil producer on the planet. They're engineers trained on equipment that now sits rusted and idle. They're families who watched the Bolivarian Revolution promise them everything and deliver a country that cannot keep the lights on. This is the terrain into which Donald Trump is now proposing to send Chevron, Exxon Mobil, and Shell. Here is the strategic problem the Trump administration is working against. Global oil prices have remained stubbornly above $70 per barrel, and American consumers are still feeling that at the pump. The administration's domestic drill, baby drill, push has not produced the supply surge needed to move prices. Trump needs a new lever. Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves on Earth. More than Saudi Arabia, more than Iran. The problem is that Venezuelan production has collapsed from over 3 million barrels per day in the 1990s to somewhere below 700,000 today. The infrastructure is not just aging, it is in many places gone, getting from 700,000 barrels per day to a figure that meaningfully moves global markets would require an investment so large, so sustained, and so protected that only a handful of companies on the planet could even attempt it. Trump's answer to that problem was to call those companies into a room and tell them to do exactly that. Trump's plan, as laid out in the East Room on Friday, is structurally simple. American oil majors, Chevron, Exxon, Shell, and others, invest at least $100 billion in a Venezuelan energy infrastructure. Production scales up dramatically. Global supply increases. Prices fall toward $50 per barrel. American consumers benefit. The president was explicit that this would not be government money. They don't need government money, Trump said, but they need government protection and need government security. He promised executives total safety and total security for their operations on Venezuelan soil. He said Venezuelan workers would do most of the ground-level labor. What he did not provide was a single binding mechanism explaining how any of those guarantees would be enforced. Think of it this way. Imagine someone asks you to renovate a house. You've renovated that house twice before. And twice before, the owner tore out your work, kept the money, and handed your tools to someone else. Now they're asking you back. The man standing at the front door is telling you this time it will be different. He's promising you security, but he is not the owner of the house. That is what Exxon Mobil CEO Darren Woods was communicating when he stood in the White House and said, on the record, Venezuela today, it's uninvestable. Woods didn't say that as a negotiating tactic. He said it because Exxon, along with ConocoPhillips, lost billions in Venezuelan nationalizations under Hugo Chavez. They went through international arbitration for years just to recover partial compensation. Chevron has been the only major American operator that maintained a reduced presence in Venezuela throughout the Maduro era, operating under a specific U.S. Treasury license. Even Chevron's exposure has been carefully capped. For these companies, Venezuela is not an opportunity that needs better optics. It is a country with a legal system that has been weaponized against foreign capital, a government the United States itself formally classifies as illegitimate, and a track record of contract violation that no insurance product on earth adequately covers. Woods put it plainly, to re-enter a third time would require some pretty significant changes from what we've historically seen here and what is currently the state. That sentence is doing enormous work. It is a public, on-record message to the administration that corporate boards and institutional shareholders will not authorize this capital deployment without structural guarantees that do not currently exist. Strip away the investment pitch for a moment. Look at what the administration has actually put in place. Earlier this week, the White House announced a separate agreement with Caracas requiring Venezuela to export up to 50 million barrels of oil to the United States. Revenue from those sales, according to Trump, will flow into accounts controlled by the U.S. government, not the Venezuelan government. In a New York Times interview this week, Trump said the United States would maintain control over Venezuela's government for much longer than a year. That is not an investment framework. That is something closer to a receivership model. The United States positioning itself as the de facto administrator of Venezuelan oil revenues. The $100 billion pitch to oil executives may, in fact, be secondary to this revenue capture architecture. The question is whether that architecture can survive contact with international law, diplomatic blowback, and the political reality in Caracas. The United Nations has already criticized the framework as interference in the affairs of a sovereign nation. So why is Trump doing this if the oil companies aren't going along? The answer may be that the pitch to executives was always partly performative. The revenue agreement with Caracas is the real mechanism. The $100 billion ask creates political cover, a narrative in which American private enterprise, not the U.S. government, is the agent of Venezuelan development. If industry leaders decline, the administration can point to their reluctance as evidence of corporate caution, not policy failure. If even a portion of them engage under sufficiently favorable terms, tax treatment, export credits, sovereign backstops, Trump can claim a win. Pull back from the East Room and look at what this moment actually signals on the global map. The Trump administration is attempting something that has no clean precedent in the modern era, using the threat of economic leverage to restructure the governance of a neighboring hemisphere nation, while simultaneously pitching private capital to finance that restructuring. The Greenland comment Trump made in the same meeting is not a distraction, is the same doctrine. The president openly told oil executives on Friday that if the United States doesn't take Greenland, China or Russia will. He said it could be acquired the easy way or the hard way. This is a unilateral reordering of the post-World War II assumption that sovereign borders are non-negotiable. Venezuela is not an anomaly, is a test case. The signal this sends to Latin America is significant. Every government in the region, regardless of ideological alignment, is now watching to see whether the United States successfully installs a revenue capture framework over a neighboring country's primary export. If it works, the playbook becomes available for other resource-rich, governance-weak nations. If it fails, it will have cost the administration significant diplomatic capital with partners whose cooperation it needs on migration, trade, and China containment. Now the hard part, the part that does not fit neatly into the pitch. Even if every executive in that room wrote a check tomorrow, Venezuelan oil production cannot be rebuilt in months. The infrastructure degradation is so severe that serious independent analyses put meaningful production recovery on a 5 to 10 year timeline at minimum. Trump's stated goal of driving global oil prices to $50 per barrel requires a supply intervention far larger and faster than anything Venezuela can deliver in a single administration. The historical parallel here is instructive. In 2003, the United States took control of Iraqi oil infrastructure after the fall of Saddam Hussein, with similar expectations of rapid production recovery and revenue flows that would offset reconstruction costs. Iraqi oil production did not return to pre-war levels until 2010, 7 years later, and the expected revenue flows never materialized on the timeline that justified the policy. Venezuela is not Iraq. The situations differ in important ways. But the underlying assumption that resource extraction can be rapidly scaled under conditions of institutional collapse has a poor track record. Here is what to monitor in the coming days. First, whether any of the executives in attendance on Friday make a public statement softening their position. A press release, an investor call comment, or a regulatory filing indicating preliminary feasibility work in Venezuela would signal that quiet negotiations are proceeding despite the public skepticism. Second, the specific terms of the U.S.-Venezuela oil export agreement. 50 million barrels is the headline number. The revenue split, the legal structure of the U.S.-controlled accounts, and whether that agreement survives a Venezuelan legal challenge will determine whether the revenue capture model is real or rhetorical. Third, the international legal response. Watch for a formal UN Security Council resolution, an OAS statement, or a Brazilian government position. Brazil under Lula has maintained a pragmatic relationship with Caracas. If Brasilia breaks publicly with the U.S. framework, it signals the regional coalition Trump needs is not materializing. If you've been watching this channel for any time, you know what we do here. We do not traffic in headlines. We track the mechanisms, the legal frameworks, the capital flows, the operational realities that sit underneath the press conference. The Venezuela story is not over. It is, in many ways, just beginning. In a follow-up, we will map exactly how the U.S. revenue capture model would function if implemented. Who holds the accounts, who authorizes the disbursements, and what legal structure would theoretically make it enforceable under international law. If that is the kind of analysis that matters to you, subscribe. Ring the bell. We do not do this for engagement numbers. We do it because these decisions have consequences for real people in Caracas, in Houston, and in every country that is now watching Washington very carefully. Drop your read on this in the comments. Are the oil companies right to hold out? Or is there a deal structure that makes Venezuela viable? Tell us what you think. Capital Brief signing off.